What I want to present today is one of a series of case studies that deal with Western Jewish converts to Islam. And one of the key questions that this project concerns itself with is what Jewish apostates can tell us about Jewish history and the modern Jewish experience. So the instinctive approach would be that, since these figures disaffiliated and disavowed their Jewish identities and their ties to Judaism, they no longer really have much to tell us about Jewish history. And what this project is looking to do is to complicate that picture by saying, well, actually, it's actually the way that they disaffiliate that bears the cultural patterns of their Jewish environments. And what I look to show is how their Jewish backgrounds actually shape the way that they understand themselves as Muslims, and sort of reconstruct the this ongoing dialogue that they have with their Jewishness, even after they've left it. So, I didn't think I would have time to talk about all of the people that I'm looking at, so I chose to focus on one of the more sensational characters I'm working on, whose name is Maryam Jamila. But I thought I'd just run through two other figures that I've been working on. So Muhammad Assad is a grandson of a Galician rabbi. I believe he's born in Lemberg and converts to Islam. He has a I can't tell the whole story here, but part of the art. I published an article about him in Jewish Social Studies in 2016, which tries to show how you can't understand the cultural logic of his sort of like Orientalist Islam without looking at the interwar Central European context he comes from, and how. In his 1954 autobiography, The Road to Mecca, he very much constructs his Muslim his Muslim identity as sort of this rootedness in the Orient, even though he'd no longer been living there for 20 years, as somehow being in this sort of like subterranean dialogue with Zionism. So sort of constructing his Islam as an alternative to it in a way, and a critique of, and another figure who is actually like the diametrical opposite of Assad, same period more or less. So if Assad tries to contrast his Muslim identity to the European superficial Jewishness that he left behind, Marcus never speaks about his Jewishness in his writings or his ego documents, but there are different ways in which he sort of subtly gestures towards that Jewishness. In very interesting ways, and this attempt to assert Islam as being as being harmonious with Germanness is very much taken from this sort of like Bildungs tradition of German Jewishness that people like Sorkin and George Massey have pointed out in the past. So. My piece on Marcus is going to appear in Jewish Quarterly Review at the end of the summer. And the person I want to talk to you about today is Maryam Jamila. So I'll start reading. So in 1989, nearly 30 years after she left the United States, Maryam Jamila published the first part of a 2-volume memoir that recorded the unlikely story of a middle-class American Jew from Westchester, New York, who moved to Pakistan and embraced the cause of conservative Islam. The first volume, entitled Memoirs of Childhood and Youth in America, consisted of some 24 letters that Jamila, formerly Margaret Marcus, had supposedly written between the ages of 11 and 28. Taken together, the letters tell the story of the first 3 decades of a life marked by social isolation, mental anguish, and cultural displacement, which were overcome through Jamila's turn to Islam. This epistolary memoir traces the author's singular path from a troubled childhood and youth in suburban America to Lahore, Pakistan, where she found her true home. So The letters are completely bogus. These weren't letters that she actually wrote, but they're fake. They are not real. She sort of doctored them after the fact. So there's these letters that I'll show you from where she's like writing them as an 11-year-old in grammar school, which so it's easier to read this as an autobiography. There's an attempt to sort of like create an arc of what led her from this sort of middle-class white upbringing to radical Islam in Pakistan. So the apocryphal letters recount Jamila's discontent with the Marcus family's assimilated all-American lifestyle and her different attempts to fill the spiritual void left by their religious indifference. Before converting to Islam, Peggy, as she was known to her family and friends, develops an interest in Orthodox Judaism. She tries joining the Young Women's Jewish Association in New York and attends the meetings of a Zionist organization as well as a youth group at an Orthodox synagogue. After her brief flirtation with Judaism, Peggy experiments with the Baha'i faith, but soon abandons it. In her late teens and early 20s, Peggy undergoes intensive psychological treatment and meets a slew of analysts at her parents' behest. She is eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia and spends 1957 to 1959 in mental institutions. Upon her release, Peggy returns to live with her parents, but their already strained relationship soon reaches a breaking point when Peggy vociferously attacks her parents for their support of Israel. After their argument, Herbert Marcus asks his daughter to leave the house and demands that she begin supporting herself. Now, of course, this breaking point is also, I believe, sort of, it's fictional, but it's very interesting that this conflict should arise over, their support of Israel. Once she leaves her parents' home, Peggy officially converts to Islam and begins corresponding with leading Muslim intellectuals around the world. Her correspondents include the Pakistani cleric Maulana Maududi and Said Ramadan, father of Tariq Ramadan and son-in-law of Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. Sensing a kindred spirit in Jamila, Maududi invites her to live with him and his family in Pakistan. Lacking any viable options in the United States, Jamila accepts his offer and moves to Lahore in 1961. So the gentleman with the white beard is Maulana Maududi. He's the leader of a conservative Islamic movement called Jamaat-e Islami, which is more or less the the Pakistani equivalent of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and sort of intellectual inspiration or inspiration to movements like Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram.
Wait, and what's the connection with her?
They correspond, and then he moves, and then he says, "Oh, why don't you come live with me in Pakistan?"
This Al-Qaeda guy.
Jamaat Islami is not a...
Well, whatever, yeah.
Yeah, and so, but the thing is that it really doesn't work out. When you invite someone you've only corresponded with to live with you, it's a catastrophe. So...
Maybe could you speak a little bit slower?
Slower? Okay.
Because the last sentence was Boko Haram, I didn't catch it.
Sorry. So, in 1963, after her release from another stint in a mental institution, Jamila marries one of Maududi's followers, becoming the second wife of Muhammad Yusuf Khan. If joining Khan's household as a second wife posed certain familial and interpersonal challenges, it also had its advantages. Never one for domestic work and ill-prepared for the responsibilities of child rearing, Jamila received the assistance of Shafiqa, whom she calls her co-wife, in maintaining the household and raising her 4 children. With much of the domestic labor presumably falling on the shoulders of her co-wife, Jamila was free to publish her treatises on Islam without the encumbrances that matrimony and motherhood might otherwise have imposed. So these are some photos of Jamila. Her archives are in the New York Public Library, which is also an interesting choice since, for someone who is so aggressively renouncing her Americanness and Jewishness, this is the place that she chooses to keep her, her correspondence and her photos, her life story, essentially. This is her in 1972.
Her co-wife?
So she enters a polygamous marriage. She becomes a wife number 2. It's the second wife, but the first wife is still there, right? And who's taking care of the children. So Jamila is also a prolific proponent of conservative Islam. She writes, this is just a selection of the books that she publishes. There's a very aggressive anti-Western bent to them. Islam it's this very essentialist and uniform vision of Islam, which is very characteristic of Islamic fundamentalism, which completely ignores, the variations in, in different geographical regions and customs. Right, this claim of like returning to the Quran. Right, so this is and this is essentially like it has a lot of Western ideas in it because it's like an Orientalist invention of Islam. And so, and this kind of turn to Islam is not unique in and of itself for Western converts. But what I'm trying to claim is that there's also a very Jewish dimension to Jamila's Islam, which I want to talk about in the context of, post-war American Jewry. So, Margaret Marcus grew up during a period when American Jews made their greatest strides toward mainstream acceptance. The post-war process of social and cultural integration involved the Jews' progressive identification as members of the white middle class. This process of economic and social ascent was the source of a profound ambivalence, even as it was celebrated as a success story. There was a sense that the Jews' social and economic achievements had somehow compromised the integrity of their ethnic and religious identity. Throughout the 1950s, rabbis, intellectuals, and communal leaders associated suburban life and middle-classness with Jewish decline. Underlying their critiques was the assumption that social marginality, poverty, and cultural isolation were what constituted authentic Jewishness. American Jewry's post-war acculturation constitutes the socio-historical crux of Jamila's childhood and adolescence, forming the backdrop to her conversion narrative. It is along these lines that I interpret Jamila's turn to Islam as a response to the identitarian dilemmas that American Jews confronted in the wake of their social and cultural integration into the American middle class. I argue that Jamila's construal of Islam anticipates the Jewish turn inward that occurred in the 1960s and analyze the similarities that link her Muslim identity to the Jewish counterculture's rhetoric of ethnic self-affirmation. Thus, whereas Jamila's conversion to Islam would seem to place her beyond the pale of American Jewish identity politics, I show how Jamila's self-fashioning as an Oriental Muslim evinces American Jewry's post-war preoccupation with questions of assimilation and authenticity. Ironically, although Jamila's conversion narrative is meant to signify a clean break with her biographical background, her story recalls the cultural patterns of the American Jewish ethnic revival of the 1960s. So, in her memoir, Jamila's image of Islam is represented not merely as the source of spiritual salvation, but is further inscribed with cultural and ethnic characteristics. The memoir encodes Islam as Oriental, non-Western, and anti-modern. This conflation, I argue, reveals the stakes of her memoir, in which conversion to Islam represents the author's renunciation of and differentiation from her suburban assimilatory setting. Jamila's conversion is not merely the story of her religious redemption, but also the reclamation of an authentic ethnic identity that was sacrificed by her family in the process of Americanization. So, here's just a quote from the first letter in the memoir. Okay, which is a letter that she supposedly sends her grandparents for their Christmas gift, and this is of course also meant to indicate, right, that like this is where this is the setting that she comes from, right? So she writes, she's thanking them for the check they give her for Christmas, and this is what she tells them. Besides being an artist, I want to go to the East and be a missionary to the Arabs to see, as Muslims, how they keep living their own kind of life. Jews like us, right, and this is, if you can believe this is an 11-year-old right here, right? Jews like us have become just like the Christians, and I don't want to see the Arabs be like that. I think their own kind of life is better, and that is why I have drawn so many pictures about it, but Mother and Daddy won't like them, and I haven't shown them to you when you come here to see us because you are not interested in art. So I'm saving the pictures and books which Daddy gave me on my birthday so I can go to Egypt or Palestine and keep the Arabs like they are instead of copying us. I think I would like to live with the Arabs in Jerusalem.
They'll probably thank you later.
Yeah. Right, so this is sort of, this is, this is giving us a sense of how she always had this sense of purpose from the beginning. She had she was alienated from the world she came from, and she was looking for some kind of alternative.
Is that a bogus letter as well?
This clearly,
That was written behind the... Okay.
This is an adult Jamila who's writing, like, she's a 60-year-old writing this about herself. Yeah.
It's obvious.
Right. And so Peggy's romantic portrayal of Arabs and Native Americans as exemplars of indigeneity and cultural authenticity throws the assimilated Jewishness of the Marcus family into sharp relief. In the letters from the 1940s, Peggy often takes up the issue of the family's secularity non-observance. She's troubled by their celebration of Christmas and Easter. Herbert and Myra Marcus take their daughters out of school on Jewish holidays, but they don't go to synagogue. They first send their kids to Sunday schools of a Reform synagogue, then it turns to the ethical culture, and eventually when they convert to Unitarianism, which she's very critical of. But she's saying, oh, there's nothing will remain of their Jewishness. But then she converts to Islam. But she claims that this Islam is actually truer to, and this is a familiar trope in the narratives of Jewish apostates and converts, is that they say that the target religion is actually truer to the spirit of the religion that they've left than the sort of superficial religiosity that their family holds to. So, here's another example, and this one is in the classroom, where her teacher's asking her about who her favorite poet is, and she says Bialik, and the teacher doesn't know who Bialik is, and then how uncomfortable she feels. So I'm jumping down 5 lines. I felt so peculiar and ill at ease. I felt as if Mother and Daddy claiming us to be such a typical American family was only a pretense. No matter how hard we tried to deny every difference between us and our Christian neighbors, they were still Christians, and we still remained Jews who didn't really belong in their world. That is why I think Reform Judaism, and this is a big jump here, but that is why I think Reform Judaism is so hypocritical, and Reform Jews are all hypocrites. Most of them don't even believe in God, much less obey Jewish laws. If I had my own way, I would rather choose Orthodoxy because they are not ashamed of their Jewishness. I don't want a counterfeit religion, I want the real thing. And that's what she supposedly finds in Islamic fundamentalism in Pakistan. But you see that there's this equivalence, there's this logic of substitution between Orthodoxy and Islam. That this is a pairing that appears quite a few times. So Jamila constructs her conversion as a critique of the Jewish middle class acculturation, positing Islam against the ideology of the American melting pot, and as an alternative to the assimilationist conformity of American Jewry. This account of self-transformation owes its coherence to the neat opposition she draws between the American middle-class setting she grew up in and the devout Muslim Pakistani she becomes. Her self-ascribed identity as subaltern Muslim stands in stark contrast to the homogenized blandness of Jewish American suburbia. Yet, contrary to Jamila's one-dimensional portrayal of Jewish American acculturation, Jews were far from indifferent to the questions of collective identity, cultural authenticity, and ethnic difference that accompanied their entry into the middle class. As Rachel Cranston, Riv Ellen Prell, and Leila Corwin-Behrman have shown, Jewish upward mobility was met with a chorus of critical voices that grappled with the implications of middle-class acculturation and its supposed threat to Jewish identity. When regarded in the context of these historical developments, we see that Jamila's memoir evokes a critical discourse on Jewish upward mobility that ran throughout the 1950s and reached its crescendo in the Jewish counterculture of the 1960s. So these are 2 examples of works that that convey the same kind of sort of discomfort with Jewish middle classness. And I can't go into the plot of Goodbye Columbus at the moment, but I think they have the years there. No, they disappeared. So this one was 1957, and I think this is 1949.
The English version, Yiddish version, 1945.
Oh, wow. So Jamila's critique of her upbringing and cultural environment did not emerge in a vacuum, but grew out of an ongoing debate that took place within the Jewish community. Throughout the 1950s, Jewish communal leaders, activists, and rabbis questioned the viability of authentic Jewish life and the prospects of Jewish survival in their new suburban environment. Figures ranging from Philip Roth to Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel criticized the spiritual impoverishment of the Jewish middle class and railed against the culture of conspicuous consumption that had spread in its rank. Jamila's memoir is suffused with the exhortatory language that characterized the rabbinical sermons, journal articles, and literary works enumerating the corrosive effects of acculturation and affluence on the spiritual vitality and cultural cohesion of American Jewry. But where it differs from these critical voices is her outright rejection of the middle class. And in this sense, she's actually closer to a movement that cropped up a bit after she converted and moved to Pakistan, which is the Jewish counterculture of the mid to late 1960s. So Jamila's indictment of the spiritual sterility of the Jewish-American suburban milieu anticipates the anti-institutional rhetoric of college-age Jews who revolted against their parents' accommodation of American middle-class norms at the expense of their ethnic and religious identity. So, like Jamila, members of the counterculture expressed a similar sense of alienation towards middle-class culture, which they derided as stifling and superficial. They denied the possibility of maintaining an authentic Jewishness within a middle-class suburban context, and like Jamila, sought to reformulate their identities as outsiders to the American mainstream. So, this one example of this is the chavurot. And of course there are big differences here because, the Havurot are very syncretistic in their religious practice and, and different elements that they sort of integrate into Jewish ritual. But what they do share with Jamila is this sort of nostalgic image of a traditionalist past, which they use in order to criticize, the existing Jewish establishment. And this is where I think that the rhetoric converges. So, so for the Chavurot and these different Jewish countercultural movements, they would wax nostalgic about Lower East Side, worker solidarity, or some sort of bogus Hasidic past. And like this, the shtetl, right? These imagined shtetls, which, supposedly there was this solidarity that we've lost now that we've become middle-class white Americans. And Jamila's image of Islam is very, very similar. So this is like her fantasy, which she shares with her therapist and then shares with us in her an autobiography, where she writes that men would wear the traditional dress of Saudi Arabia and women would be veiled from head to foot. Inside the house, there would be no tables, chairs, or beds. Everybody would sit and sleep on mats and carpets, no knives or forks. Everybody would eat the way the Holy Prophet recommended, with their fingers out of the common dish. The Muslim zealots would destroy all the machines and factories, and everything would be made at home or in small shops by hand. Right? So this sort of like anti-modernist fantasy is, this is not something that that is unique to Jamila. It's something that a lot of countercultural movements in the United States during that time are using to imagine cultural alternatives, and all of this, in just a few words, is really is very much influenced by the rise of the Black Power movement, which is paving the way for a form of dissent which is not integrative, which is saying no, there are other ways of being American, and so. So there's this recent book by Mark Dollinger, which is arguing actually, we tend to think of this the mid '60s as a point where the trajectories of Jews and blacks in America part, but actually that's not the case. The rise of Black Power was good, was good for the Jews in the sense that it showed Jews another way to to express themselves and assert their identity as a thick ethnic identity, which didn't, which broke with Cold War liberalism, and this is very, and so I didn't have a chance to talk about the racial dimension of Jamila's autobiography, but it's clearly there because this Islam is really a proxy for this ethno-racial otherness. It's always a critique of white middle-class America. And I'll just end with this bizarre letter. We can't really read it here, but this is her I think it's a picture of a granddaughter or a daughter, or maybe it's a picture of her, which she's adding to her own collection, which is so interesting that it indicates who she's having this dialogue with, right? It's like she wants to add this to her archive at the New York Public Library. She never really lets go of this past, and it's the pillar of her own Muslim identity, what it contrasts to. So I can't read.
Can magnify it.
No, I think she wants to add to the Mario Jamil papers. Shafika something. I think it's her enclosed photo of my co-wife. I think maybe it's the daughter of her co-wife. So I don't know what you would call that. Stepdaughter? So I'm really out of time. So I'm going to end here, and maybe I'll get a chance to elaborate on this when we have the Q&A. Thank you.